The autumn rain hammered against the wooden shutters of the Hartwell homestead like bullets from an angry god. Inside, Emma Hartwell pressed her back against the door, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she listened to the thunder of hooves circling her home. 8-year-old Tommy clutched his little sister Lucy to his chest behind the overturned kitchen table, their eyes wide with terror. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows across the room as Emma's trembling fingers found the cold steel of her late husband's revolver. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Mama," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Are the bad men here?" Emma's heart shattered as she looked at her children, knowing that in moments, everything they had left would be torn away. Outside, a voice cut through. The rain like a blade through silk, cold and measured, belonging to a man who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. The voice of Jake Morrison, the ghost of the Razorback Mountains, the most feared bandit in all of Arizona territory. "Mrs. Hartwell," came the call from beyond the door. "I know you're in there. This doesn't have to be hard." The storm that lashed the Arizona territory on that October night in 1882 was the kind that old-timers would speak of for decades. It rolled down from the Razorback Mountains like the wrath of heaven itself, turning the normally dry creek beds into raging torrents, and the dusty trails into rivers of mud. Most sensible folks had battened down and were waiting it out by their hearths. But Jake Morrison wasn't most folks, and tonight wasn't about sense. Jake sat hunched in his saddle atop a ridge overlooking the Hartwell homestead, rain streaming from the brim of his black hat in steady rivulets. His horse, a steel-gray stallion named Phantom, shifted restlessly beneath him, eager to find shelter from the punishing weather. But Jake didn't move. He'd been watching the small ranch house for 3 hours, studying the patterns of light in the windows, counting the shadows that moved behind the thin curtains. Professional habits died hard, and Jake Morrison was nothing if not professional. The letter in his coat pocket had grown soggy from the persistent moisture, but he didn't need to read it again. He'd memorized every word, every carefully crafted lie that Colonel Garrett Blackstone had penned. The job was simple, Blackstone had written. A widow and her 2 young children were squatting on valuable military land. The railroad needed the territory for expansion, and the Army needed it for strategic positioning. Remove the obstacles. Collect $5,000 in gold, and ask no questions. Jake had taken harder jobs for less money. In the 8 years since he'd turned his back on the law, he'd robbed 17 trains, countless stagecoaches, and more banks than he bothered to count. His reputation stretched from the Mexican border to the Canadian territories. They called him the Ghost because he appeared without warning and vanished without a trace, leaving behind only empty strongboxes and terrorized witnesses who could barely describe the man who'd robbed them blind. But as Jake watched the warm glow emanating from the Hartwell windows, something twisted uncomfortably in his chest. Through the rain-lashed glass, he could make out the silhouette of a woman moving about the kitchen, her movements quick and efficient as she prepared what looked like a simple evening meal. Occasionally, smaller shadows would dart across his field of vision, children playing despite the storm raging outside their door. Jake Morrison hadn't always been a killer. Once, a lifetime ago, he'd been Captain Jacob Morrison of the 3rd Arizona Cavalry, a decorated officer with a wife named Caroline and a 6-year-old daughter named Rebecca. They'd lived in a small house not unlike the one below him, filled with laughter and hope and plans for the future. Caroline had been pregnant with their 2nd child when the Confederate raiders came through their valley like a plague of locusts, burning everything in their path. Jake had been away on patrol when it happened. He'd returned to find his home reduced to ash and bone, his wife and daughter among the 17 civilians murdered in what the Confederate commander later called a strategic necessity. The unborn child had died with Carolyn, and with them had died everything good and decent in Jake Morrison's soul. The army had offered him medals and promotions, but Jake had seen through their hollow words. Justice was a luxury for men who could afford to wait for it, and Jake Morrison had learned that sometimes you had to take what you needed with your own hands. He'd resigned his commission, bought himself a fast horse and faster guns, and set about carving his pain into the world one robbery at a time. Now 8 years later, he found himself preparing to destroy another family, another home filled with the kind of warmth and love he'd once known. The irony wasn't lost on him. Colonel Blackstone had chosen his weapon well. Jake Morrison, a man who understood exactly what he was about to take from Emma Hartwell and her children, because it had been taken from him first. Thunder cracked overhead like the sound of God's own rifle, and Jake preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake finally spurred Phantom down the muddy slope toward the homestead. The house was modest but well maintained, with a wide front porch and flower boxes beneath the windows that spoke of a woman's touch. A small barn stood to one side, sheltering what looked like a milk cow and a few chickens. Beyond that, Jake could make out the posts of a modest cattle operation, though the herd was nowhere to be seen in the storm. As he approached, details emerged that Colonel Blackstone's letter had failed to mention. The fence posts were new, the barn recently painted. This wasn't the ramshackle operation of squatters. This was a working ranch, built with care and maintained with pride. Someone had invested time and money here, had put down roots with the intention of staying. Jake dismounted near the front porch, his boots squelching in the mud as he approached the door. Through the windows, he could hear the faint sound of a woman's voice, soft and melodic, singing what sounded like a lullaby. The sound hit him like a physical blow, so reminiscent of Caroline's voice that for a moment he couldn't breathe. He forced himself to focus on the task at hand. $5,000 was more money than most men saw in a lifetime, enough to disappear completely, maybe head south to Mexico, where the past couldn't follow. All he had to do was walk through that door and finish what Blackstone had started. Simple, clean, professional. But as Jake raised his hand to knock, a child's laughter drifted through the storm, high and pure, and filled with the kind of innocent joy that belonged to a world he'd thought was lost forever. His knuckles hovered inches from the wood, trembling not from the cold, but from something deeper, something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Inside the house, Emma Hartwell was completely unaware of the death that waited on her doorstep. She was focused entirely on her children, on the simple domestic ritual of preparing their evening meal and keeping their spirits up despite the howling storm outside. Tommy, her eldest, sat at the kitchen table working on his arithmetic while Lucy played with a cornhusk doll that Emma had made for her last Christmas. "Mama," Tommy said, looking up from his slate, "when is Papa coming home?" Emma's heart clenched at the question that came with increasing frequency as the weeks passed. William had been dead for 3 months, killed when his horse had spooked, and thrown him into the rocks while he was checking the cattle in the high pasture. But she couldn't bring herself to tell the children that Papa wasn't coming home, not ever. They'd been through enough upheaval already. "Papa's checking on the silver mine, remember?" she said, stirring the pot of stew that would have to stretch for another day. "He'll be home when he's finished with his work." It wasn't entirely a lie. William had discovered silver on their property just days before his death, a vein that ran deep beneath the grazing land where their cattle roamed. He'd been so excited, talking about how they'd finally have enough money to expand the ranch, maybe even send the children back east for proper schooling. Now the knowledge of that silver felt like a curse, drawing the attention of men like Colonel Blackstone, who saw opportunity in a widow's vulnerability. Emma had received Blackstone's first offer to purchase the property just 2 weeks after William's funeral. when she'd politely declined, explaining that the ranch was her children's inheritance. The offers had become increasingly insistent. The last letter had arrived 3 days ago. Not an offer, but an ultimatum: give up the land voluntarily, or face the consequences of her stubbornness. A particularly loud crack of thunder made Lucy jump, and Emma quickly scooped her daughter into her arms, humming the lullaby that never failed to calm her fears. She was so focused on comforting the little girl that she almost missed the sound of approaching hoofbeats, the heavy tread of boots on her front porch. When the knock finally came, firm and deliberate against her door, Emma's blood turned to ice in her veins. No honest traveler would be out in weather like this, and the neighbors were all miles away. She knew, with the terrible certainty that comes to women who've learned to recognize danger, that Colonel Blackstone had finally made good on his threats. "Children," she whispered, setting Lucy down gently, "go hide behind the table, quickly, and don't make a sound." Tommy, wise beyond his 8 years, immediately understood the gravity in his mother's voice. He grabbed Lucy's hand and pulled her toward the overturned table that Emma kept in the corner for just such an emergency. Emma had never explained why she'd started practicing these drills with them, but Tommy was smart enough to know that sometimes bad men came to houses where children lived. Emma moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the figure standing on her porch. Even in the storm, she could make out the shape of a tall man in a long coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. Lightning flashed, illuminating him for just an instant, and Emma caught a glimpse of cold eyes and a face that spoke of violence and death. "Mrs. Hartwell," came the voice through the door, calm and measured despite the chaos of the storm. "I know you're in there. This doesn't have to be hard." Emma's hand found William's revolver where she'd placed it on the shelf beside the door. Her husband had taught her to shoot, and she was a fair hand with the weapon, but she knew that skill alone wouldn't be enough against a professional killer. Still, she'd die before she let harm come to her children. "What do you want?" she called out, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Just to talk, ma'am. Colonel Blackstone sent me to discuss your situation." Emma nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Men like this didn't come to talk. They came to take what they wanted and eliminate anyone who stood in their way. But perhaps she could buy time, think of some way to get the children to safety. "It's late," she said, "and the storm's too fierce for visitors. Come back in the morning." "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mrs. Hartwell. Open the door." The politeness in his tone was somehow more terrifying than outright threats would have been. This was a man who'd done terrible things while maintaining perfect manners, who could kill a family and still tip his hat to their neighbors the next morning. Emma looked back at her children, huddled together behind the table like frightened rabbits. Tommy had his arms wrapped protectively around Lucy, his young face set in lines too serious for his age. These babies were everything good left in her world, the only living remnants of her love for William. Whatever happened next, she had to find a way to protect them. Outside, Jake Morrison stood perfectly still despite the rain soaking through his coat. Something was wrong here, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Blackstone had described Emma Hartwell as a desperate woman, barely scraping by, someone who would be grateful for the opportunity to sell her worthless land and move somewhere more suitable for raising children. But the homestead Jake was looking at showed every sign of prosperity and permanence. More troubling was his own reaction to the scene. The sound of the woman's voice, the warmth emanating from the windows, the evidence of a family trying to build something lasting in an unforgiving world, it all reminded him too forcefully of what he'd lost. For 8 years he'd been able to push down those memories, to focus on the cold mathematics of survival and revenge. But standing here, preparing to destroy something so similar to what had been taken from him, Jake found his resolve wavering in ways that terrified him. "Mrs. Hartwell," he called again, "I'm going to count to 10. If you haven't opened this door by then, I'm going to assume you're not interested in the easy way." Inside, Emma's mind raced through impossible options. The back door was too far from where the children were hidden, and she couldn't reach it without exposing them to danger. The windows were too high and too small for quick escape. Her only real choice was to face whatever waited outside and pray that she could somehow convince this man to spare her children's lives. Taking a deep breath, Emma moved toward the door, the revolver heavy in her trembling hand. Behind her, she could hear Lucy's quiet sniffling and Tommy's whispered reassurances. These might be the last sounds she ever heard from her babies, and the thought nearly brought her to her knees. But Emma Hartwell had not survived the frontier. The loss of her husband, and the constant threat of men like Colonel Blackstone by giving in to despair. She was William's wife and Tommy and Lucy's mother, and she would face whatever came with the dignity and courage that those titles demanded. "I'm opening the door," she called out, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "But I'm armed, and I'll use this gun if you try to hurt my children." "I understand, ma'am. Just open the door slowly, and we'll talk like civilized people." Emma's hand shook as she reached for the latch, knowing that once she opened this door, there would be no going back. Whatever this man had come here to do would be set in motion, and she could only pray that when it was over, her children would still be breathing. The door swung open, and Emma found herself face to face with death itself. Emma Hartwell stood in the doorway, her husband's revolver steady in her grip, despite the trembling that ran through her entire body. Before her loomed a figure that seemed carved from the storm itself, tall and imposing in his dark coat, rain streaming from the brim of his black hat. Lightning illuminated his face for a brief moment, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of winter steel. This was Jake Morrison, though Emma didn't yet know the name that struck fear into the hearts of lawmen and outlaws alike across the territory. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying a strange gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation. "I appreciate you opening the door. Might I step inside out of this weather? I give you my word that I won't make any sudden movements." Emma's finger tightened on the trigger. "Say what you came to say from where you stand." "My children are sleeping, and I won't have them disturbed by Colonel Blackstone's business." Jake's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise. "You know who sent me." "I know enough," Emma replied, her chin lifting with defiance that impressed Jake despite himself. "I know that the Colonel wants my land, and I know that he's not the type of man to accept no for an answer. I also know that he wouldn't send a gentleman to do his dirty work." A ghost of a smile played at the corners of Jake's mouth. "No, ma'am, I don't suppose he would." He studied her face in the lamplight that spilled from the doorway, noting the determined set of her jaw and the fierce protectiveness that blazed in her dark eyes. This wasn't the broken, desperate woman that Blackstone had described. This was a mother defending her cubs, and Jake had learned long ago that there was nothing more dangerous in all of creation. "The Colonel's offer still stands," Jake said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "He's prepared to pay fair market value for your property. You and your children could start fresh somewhere safer, somewhere more suited to a woman raising children alone." Emma's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Fair market value? Is that what he's calling it now? $300 for 800 acres of prime grazing land with water rights and mineral deposits. I may be a woman, Mr. Morrison, but I'm not a fool." Jake's surprise deepened. Blackstone had told him the woman knew nothing about the silver, that she was simply a stubborn squatter who needed to be convinced to move along. But Emma Hartwell spoke with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what her property was worth and why powerful men wanted it. "You know about the silver," he said, and it wasn't a question. "My husband found the vein 2 days before he died," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the pain that flashed across her features. "We were going to have it properly surveyed, maybe bring in partners who could help us develop it responsibly. Instead, I've had a parade of vultures circling. Ever since William's funeral, each one more insistent than the last. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through his clothes. Blackstone hadn't just lied about Emma's circumstances, he'd lied about everything. This wasn't a woman squatting on military land. This was a legitimate property owner being pressured to sell at a fraction of her land's true value. And when she'd refused, Blackstone had hired Jake to remove the obstacle permanently. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jake said carefully, "what exactly did the colonel tell you about the legal status of your property?" Emma's grip on the revolver never wavered. "He claims that William's death invalidated our homestead rights, that as a widow, I have no legal claim to the land. He says the Army has jurisdiction over all territory within 20 miles of the fort, and that I'm here illegally." Her eyes blazed with righteous anger. "But I've seen our deed, Mr. Morrison. It's properly filed and witnessed, and there's nothing in the homestead laws that says a widow can't inherit her husband's claim." Jake's jaw tightened as the full scope of Blackstone's deception became clear. The colonel wasn't acting on behalf of the Army or the railroad. He was running a private land grab operation, using his military position to intimidate legitimate property owners into selling their holdings for a fraction of their worth. Jake had been hired not as a government contractor, but as a common thief, sent to murder an innocent woman and her children for the sake of Blackstone's greed. The realization should have made the job easier. Jake Morrison had killed plenty of men who deserved it less than Colonel Blackstone. But standing here on Emma Hartwell's porch, watching her fierce determination to protect her children and their future, Jake found himself thinking not of the $5,000 waiting for him, but of Carolyn and Rebecca and the home they'd tried to build together before the war had torn it all away. "Your husband," Jake said quietly, "how did he die?" Emma's composure wavered for just a moment. "His horse threw him while he was checking the cattle in the high pasture. He hit the rocks wrong, broke his neck. The horse came back without him, and I found him the next morning." She swallowed hard. "William was an excellent horseman, Mr. Morrison. In all the years I knew him, I never saw him take a fall from any horse, no matter how green or ornery." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake had seen enough convenient accidents in his time to recognize the signs of foul play, and Emma Hartwell was clearly intelligent enough to harbor the same suspicions. If Blackstone had already killed her husband, then hiring Jake to finish. The job was just the colonel's way of covering his tracks while adding the sheen of official sanction to murder. Behind Emma, a small voice piped up from the kitchen. "Mama, who's at the door?" Emma's entire body went rigid, and Jake saw terror flash across her face as she realized that her children were no longer safely hidden behind the overturned table. Tommy Hartwell, all of 8 years old with his father's sandy hair and his mother's determined chin, had crept close enough to peer around the doorframe. "Tommy, go back to your sister," Emma said, her voice sharp with fear. "Now." But the boy's curiosity was stronger than his obedience, and he took another step forward, his wide eyes fixed on the intimidating figure of Jake Morrison. "Are you here about Papa?" Tommy asked, his young voice filled with hope that made Jake's chest tighten painfully. "Did you find him in the mountains?" Emma closed her eyes in anguish, and Jake realized that she'd been lying to her children about their father's death, probably to spare them the additional pain of grief on top of their already precarious situation. The boy still believed his father was coming home, still held on to the innocent faith that everything would somehow work out if he just waited long enough. "Tommy," Emma said again, her voice breaking slightly, "please go to Lucy. Mama needs to finish talking to this gentleman." Jake looked at the boy, seeing himself at that age, believing that his father could protect their family from anything the world might throw at them. He thought of Rebecca, who'd been just 2 years younger than Tommy when the raiders had come, who'd probably called out for her papa in those final terrible moments. "Your papa," Jake said slowly, crouching down to bring himself closer to Tommy's eye level. "He was a good man who loved you and your sister very much." Tommy's face lit up with excitement. You knew Papa? Did he send you to bring us to him? The innocent question hit Jake like a physical blow. Here was a child so desperate for good news that he was willing to trust a complete stranger, so hungry for hope that he'd grasp at any possibility of his father's return. Jake had come here to make Tommy and his sister orphans, to destroy the last remnants of their family for the sake of Blackstone's greed and his own blood money. "Tommy," Emma said desperately. "Please, he's not coming back, son," Jake said quietly, the words scraping his throat like broken glass. "I'm sorry, but your papa isn't coming back." The light died in Tommy's eyes as if someone had blown out a candle. Emma made a soft sound of protest, but Jake continued, his voice gentle despite the harshness of his words. "But that doesn't mean you're alone. Your mama's here, and she's going to take care of you and Lucy no matter what happens." Tommy's lower lip trembled, and tears began to spill down his cheeks. "But who's going to teach me to ride like Papa did? Who's going to show me how to work the cattle?" Jake felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 8 long years. "Maybe someone else will," he said. "Someone who remembers what it was like to have a papa, who loved him." Emma stared at Jake in shock, clearly not understanding why a man sent to kill her family was comforting her son instead of completing his mission. But Jake barely noticed her confusion. All his attention was focused on Tommy, on the grief and fear and desperate hope warring in the boy's young face. From deeper in the house came the sound of Lucy's voice, thin and scared. "Tommy? Mama? Where is everybody?" Emma's resolve finally cracked. "Excuse me," she whispered to Jake, and turned to gather her daughter before the little girl could wander into even more danger. Jake remained crouched by the door, listening to Emma's soft murmurs as she comforted both children, explaining that a stranger had come to visit, but that everything was going to be all right. Her voice held a strength that Jake envied, the kind of steady reassurance that he remembered Carolyn giving to Rebecca during thunderstorms, or when bedtime monsters seemed too real to ignore. When Emma returned to the doorway, she was carrying Lucy, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The little girl had her thumb in her mouth and her other arm wrapped around a tattered cornhusk doll, and she regarded Jake with the solemn gravity that some children possess when they sense that the adult world has suddenly become dangerous. "Mr. Morrison," Emma said, her voice steady again but somehow different, as if Jake's kindness to Tommy had shifted something fundamental in her perception of him. "What exactly are you here to do?" Jake stood slowly, his joints protesting from the cold and damp. The question hung between them like a loaded gun, and Jake found himself at a crossroads he'd never expected to face. He could tell her the truth that Blackstone had hired him to kill them all and claim the land as abandoned property. He could lie and say he was just there to deliver another offer. Or he could do something that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over the past 8 years. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said finally, "I think you and your children are in more danger than you realize." Emma's arms tightened protectively around Lucy. "What kind of danger?" Jake glanced over his shoulder at the storm-lashed landscape, calculating distances and time. Other men would be coming eventually, men who wouldn't hesitate to finish what Jake had failed to start. If he was going to keep this family alive, he needed to move quickly. "The kind that doesn't knock politely on your door," he said. "The kind that comes in the night and leaves no witnesses behind." Understanding dawned in Emma's eyes, and with it came a terror so profound that Jake could see her fighting to keep from collapsing. "He sent you to kill us." Yes, the simple admission seemed to echo in the space between them, final and irrevocable. Emma stared at him for a long moment, her mind clearly racing through implications and possibilities, trying to understand why a man who'd been sent to murder her family was instead warning her of danger. "But you're not going to," she said. And it wasn't quite a question. "No," Jake replied. "I'm not." Emma swayed slightly, as if the relief was too much to bear. "Why?" Jake looked at Tommy, who was still standing in the doorway despite his tears, trying to be brave for his mother and sister. He thought of Caroline and Rebecca, of the home they'd tried to build and the future that had been stolen from them. He thought of 8 years spent running from the pain, 8 years of trying to outrun his grief by becoming someone else entirely. Because, he said simply, some things are worth more than money. Lucy chose that moment to peek out from behind her mother's shoulder, her large brown eyes fixed on Jake with the fearless curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked, her voice muffled by her thumb. "I suppose I am," Jake replied, surprising himself with the gentleness in his own voice. "Tommy wants to be a cowboy too," Lucy informed him seriously. "But Mama says cowboys have to be very brave and very good, and Tommy's only a little bit brave right now." Jake glanced at Tommy, who was scowling at his sister's assessment of his courage. "I think your brother's braver than he knows," Jake said. "It takes a lot of courage to try to protect your mama and sister." Tommy's chest puffed out slightly at the praise, and some of the fear left his young face. "I'm going to be the bravest cowboy in all of Arizona," he declared. "And I'm going to have the fastest horse and the biggest hat." "Those are worthy goals," Jake said solemnly. "But first, you need to help your mama pack some things. You're all going to have to leave here for a while." Emma's brief moment of relief evaporated. "Leave? This is our home, Mr. Morrison. Everything we have is here." "Everything you have won't matter if you're dead," Jake replied bluntly. "Blackstone isn't going to give up just because I failed to complete his job. He'll send other men, and they won't waste time talking." Emma looked around at the home she'd built with her husband, at the life they'd created together in this remote corner of the territory. Every piece of furniture, every small decoration, every board and nail represented their dreams and struggles and hopes for the future. The thought of abandoning it all was almost unbearable. "Where would we go?" she asked. "I have no family. No money beyond what little I've managed to save. And if Colonel Blackstone is as powerful as you suggest, is there anywhere in the territory that would be safe?" Jake had been asking himself the same question since he'd made the decision to protect his family instead of destroying it. Blackstone's reach was extensive, and his connections in the military and territorial government would make it difficult to find sanctuary anywhere within official channels. But Jake Morrison hadn't survived 8 years as an outlaw without learning where the law's authority ended and the frontier's own justice began. "There's a woman named Martha Whitfield who runs a trading post about 30 miles north of here," he said. "She's helped travelers before, folks who needed to disappear for a while. If anyone can keep you safe until I can deal with Blackstone, it's her." Emma stared at him in amazement. "You're going after the Colonel?" "I'm going to finish the job he hired me for," Jake said grimly. "Just not the way he expected." The implications of what Jake was suggesting began to sink in. Emma realized that this man, this killer who'd been sent to destroy her family, was instead offering to risk his own life to protect them. It defied everything she thought she knew about the world, about the nature of good and evil, about the possibility of redemption in even the darkest souls. "Why would you do this for us?" she whispered. "You don't even know us." Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm that showed no signs of abating. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of old grief and new purpose. "I had a family once," he said. "A wife and daughter. They were killed while I was away, burned alive by men who thought their lives were less important than whatever they were fighting for." He met Emma's eyes and she saw pain there that matched her own. "I couldn't save them, but maybe I can save you." Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she understood the magnitude of what Jake was offering. He wasn't just risking his life for strangers, he was choosing to honor his lost family by protecting hers, finding a way to transform his grief into something redemptive rather than destructive. "Mr. Morrison," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "We don't have time for gratitude, Mrs. Hartwell. We need to move quickly. Pack only what you absolutely need: clothing, food, anything valuable that you can carry easily. Leave everything else." Emma nodded, her mind already racing through the practicalities of flight. "How long do we have?" "Not long. An hour, maybe 2 if we're lucky. Blackstone will expect a report from me by dawn, and when he doesn't get one, he'll send others to investigate." Emma set Lucy down gently and turned to her children. "Tommy, Lucy, we're going to play a game. We need to pack our traveling bags as quickly as we can, just like we're going on an adventure. Can you help Mama do that?" Tommy, who'd been listening to the adult conversation with wide eyes, seemed to understand that something serious was happening, even if he didn't grasp all the details. "Are we going to see Papa?" he asked hopefully. Emma's heart clenched, but she forced herself to smile. "We're going to go somewhere safe, sweetheart. That's what Papa would want us to do." As the children scurried off to gather their belongings, Emma turned back to Jake. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "Go ahead. My husband's death, was it really an accident?" Jake's silence was answer enough. Emma closed her eyes, grief and rage warring in her chest as the confirmation of her worst fears settled over her like a shroud. William hadn't died in a random accident. He'd been murdered, probably by the same men who now wanted to finish what they'd started. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly. Emma opened her eyes, and Jake was surprised to see not tears, but a cold fury that rivaled his own. "Make them pay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the force of a thunderclap. "Whatever you do to Colonel Blackstone and his men, make them pay for what they took from my children." Jake nodded, recognizing in Emma's eyes the same hunger for justice that had driven him for the past 8 years. "I will." As Emma hurried to pack their few possessions, Jake stepped out onto the porch to study the storm-swept landscape. Somewhere out there in the darkness, other killers were probably already riding toward the Hartwell homestead. Men who wouldn't be swayed by the sight of innocent children or a mother's desperate courage. Jake had maybe an hour's head start, and he intended to use every minute of it. But as he listened to the sounds of the family preparing for flight, heard Tommy asking earnest questions about their adventure, and Lucy singing softly to her doll, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 long years. For the first time since Carolyn and Rebecca had been taken from him, Jake Morrison had found something worth fighting for that didn't involve revenge or blood money. He had found a family to save. Within the hour, the Hartwell homestead had been transformed from a warm family dwelling into a scene of hurried departure. Emma moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were abandoning. She packed their most essential clothing into 2 canvas bags, added what little food would travel well, and carefully wrapped the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother. The deed to their property went into a waterproof pouch, along with William's last letter and the small daguerreotype of their wedding day. Tommy helped by gathering his and Lucy's favorite belongings, though Emma had to gently explain that they couldn't take everything. The boy's wooden horse, carved by his father's own hands, made it into the bag. Lucy's cornhusk doll was clutched firmly in her small arms, never to be abandoned. But the larger toys, the books, the little treasures accumulated over years of family life all had to be left behind, standing as silent witnesses to the life they were being forced to flee. Jake Morrison stood watch by the window, his experienced eyes scanning the storm-lashed landscape for any sign of approaching riders. The rain continued its relentless assault on the territory, turning the normally dusty trails into rivers of mud and making travel treacherous for man and beast alike. While the weather would slow any pursuit, it would also make their own journey to Martha Whitfield's trading post a dangerous undertaking, especially with 2 young children in tow. "Mrs. Hartwell, Jake said without turning from his vigil. Do you have horses? A wagon? We have 2 horses in the barn, Emma replied, carefully folding Lucy's small dress. William's gelding, Thunder, and my mare, Starlight. There's also an old wagon, but I'm not sure it would hold up in this weather. Jake nodded grimly. We'll have to ride hard and fast. The wagon would only slow us down, and if Blackstone's men catch up to us on an open trail. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Emma understood the implications perfectly. Tommy's learning to ride, but Lucy's too small to manage a horse on her own in weather like this, Emma said, worry creeping into her voice. She can ride. With me, Jake offered. I've got experience keeping folks safe in the saddle, even in rough conditions. Emma paused in her packing, studying Jake's profile as he continued his watch. There was something about the way he'd spoken to her children. A gentleness that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. She found herself wondering about the family he'd lost, about the man he'd been before grief and revenge had transformed him into the ghost of the Razorback Mountains. Mr. Morrison, she said quietly, the wife and daughter you lost, what were their names? Jake's shoulders tensed slightly, and for a moment Emma thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she had to strain to hear it over the storm. Caroline was my wife's name. She had hair the color of autumn leaves and a laugh that could fill a room with sunshine. Our daughter was Rebecca. She would have been 14 this year if she'd lived. She had Caroline's laugh and her mother's stubborn streak, but she was gentle with hurt animals and never met a stranger she couldn't befriend. Emma felt her heart ache for this man who carried such profound loss. They sound wonderful. They were everything good in the world, Jake said simply. When they were taken from me, I thought that goodness had died with them. I've spent 8 years trying to prove that theory correct. And now? Jake finally turned from the window, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. Now I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong. Before Emma could respond, Lucy's voice piped up from where she sat on the floor, carefully arranging her doll's tiny dress. Mr. Morrison, are you sad because your little girl can't come with us on our adventure? The innocent question hit Jake like a physical blow. He crouched down beside Lucy, his weathered face softening as he looked at the child who reminded him so much of Rebecca at that age. Yes, little one, he said gently. My little girl had to go on a different kind of adventure, one where I can't follow her just yet. Lucy considered this with the serious concentration that children bring to important matters. Mama says Papa went on an adventure too, but he's going to come back when he's finished. Will your little girl come back? Jake glanced at Emma, who was watching the exchange with tears in her eyes. I don't think so, Lucy, but maybe that's all right, because she's somewhere safe now, somewhere where no one can hurt her ever again. Like heaven? Yes, like heaven. Lucy nodded sagely, apparently satisfied with this explanation. When we go on our adventure, will you tell me stories about your little girl? I like stories. Jake felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for 8 long years. I'd like that very much. Tommy, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with the hesitant courage of a boy trying to be braver than he felt. Mr. Morrison, sir, are you going to be our papa now? The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications and innocent hope. Emma started to protest, to explain that Mr. Morrison was just helping them temporarily, but Jake held up a gentle hand to stop her. Tommy, he said seriously, no one could ever replace your papa. He was a good man who loved you and Lucy and your mama more than anything in the world. But if you'll have me, I'd be honored to look after you all for as long as you need looking. After, Tommy's face lit up with the first genuine smile Emma had seen from him since William's death. Would you teach me to shoot? Papa said he'd teach me when I got older, but when you're ready, Jake promised. And when your mama says it's all right. Emma felt overwhelmed by the strange turn her life had taken. Hours ago, She'd been a widow struggling to protect her children from forces beyond her understanding. Now she found herself under the protection of the most feared outlaw in the territory, a man who spoke to her children with the tenderness of a father and who seemed genuinely committed to their welfare. "The horses are ready," Jake announced, having completed a quick reconnaissance of the barn. "We need to leave now. The storm's starting to break, and that means Blackstone's men won't be far behind." Emma gathered her children close, taking one last look around the home that had held so much happiness and so many dreams. The fire in the hearth was burning low, casting dancing shadows on the walls where William's rifle still hung and where Lucy's drawings were pinned with loving care. In the morning, strangers would rifle through their belongings, searching for anything of value before probably burning the whole place to the ground. "Mama," Tommy said, tugging at her skirt, "are we ever coming back?" Emma knelt down and pulled both children into her arms, breathing in their familiar scent and trying to memorize the feeling of their small bodies pressed against hers. "I don't know, sweetheart. But wherever we go, we'll be together, and that's what matters most." Jake appeared in the doorway, his hat and coat dripping with rain. "The horses are saddled and ready. We need to move." The journey to the barn was a nightmare of wind and driving rain. Emma carried Lucy while Tommy struggled to keep up, his small legs no match for the muddy terrain. Jake moved like a shadow. Beside them, one hand on his rifle and his eyes constantly scanning for threats that might emerge from the storm-lashed darkness. Thunder, William's big chestnut gelding, danced nervously as Jake approached, but the horse seemed to sense that. This man knew his way around dangerous situations. Starlight, Emma's gentle mare, stood more calmly, though her ears were pricked forward with alertness. Jake quickly checked the cinches and stirrups, making sure everything was secure for the hard ride ahead. "Tommy, you'll ride with your mama." "On Starlight," Jake instructed. "Keep your arms around her waist and hold tight, no matter what happens. Lucy, you're with me on Thunder. I know he's big, but he's also the steadiest horse I've ever seen." As Jake lifted Lucy into the saddle, the little girl looked down at him with complete trust. "Will you hold me tight so I don't fall?" "Tighter than bark on a tree," Jake promised, swinging up behind her. "You just close your eyes and pretend we're flying through the clouds." Emma mounted Starlight with Tommy's help, the boy clambering up behind her with the determination of someone twice his age. As they prepared to leave the only home the children had ever known, Emma felt a crushing weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was trusting the lives of her babies to a man she'd known for less than 2 hours, a man whose reputation was built on violence and death. But as she looked at Jake Morrison, saw the gentle way he held her daughter and the protective intensity in his eyes, Emma realized that sometimes the most dangerous people were also the most capable of keeping you safe. This man had found something worth protecting in her family, and she sensed that he would die before he let harm come to them. "Ready?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Emma nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around herself and Tommy. "Ready." They rode out into the storm like ghosts fleeing the dawn, leaving behind the warm lights of the homestead and plunging into a darkness that seemed absolute. The rain hit them with renewed fury, stinging their faces and making visibility nearly impossible. But Jake seemed to navigate by instinct, guiding them along trails that Emma couldn't even see in the gloom. For the first hour, they rode in tense silence, the only sounds the thunder of hooves on muddy ground and the constant roar of wind and rain. Lucy had indeed fallen asleep in Jake's arms, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the security of his protective embrace. Tommy clung to his mother with fierce determination, his small body shivering with cold, but his spirit unbroken. As they climbed into the foothills of the Razorback Mountains, the storm began to show signs of weakening. The rain lessened from a driving torrent to a steady downpour, and occasional breaks in the clouds allowed glimpses of starlight to pierce the gloom. Jake used these moments to check their bearings, his keen eyes picking out landmarks that would guide them to safety. "How much farther?" Emma called out during one such break in the weather. "Another 2 hours, maybe 3, Jake replied. "Martha's place is tucked back in a canyon that's hard to find unless you know what you're looking for. But we'll need to rest the horses soon, and the children need to get warm and dry." As if summoned by his words, a flash of lightning illuminated a small overhang of rock ahead, sheltered from the worst of the weather and large enough to provide temporary refuge. Jake guided them toward it, dismounting quickly to help Emma and the children down from their horses. The relief of being out of the direct assault of the storm was overwhelming. Emma sank down on a relatively dry patch of ground, pulling Tommy close while Jake gently transferred the still sleeping Lucy to her arms. The little girl stirred briefly, mumbling something about flying horses before settling back into peaceful slumber. Jake moved with quiet efficiency, checking the horses and scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. When he was satisfied that they were temporarily safe, he returned to where Emma sat with her children, his face grave in the dim light filtering through the storm clouds. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, settling down beside them, "there's something you need to know about what we're likely to face in the coming days." Emma looked up at him, seeing the weight of hard experience in his weathered features. "Tell me." "Colonel Blackstone isn't going to give up easily. He's invested too much in acquiring your land to simply walk away because one hired gun had a change of heart. He'll send more men, and they'll be under orders to bring back proof that the job was completed." "What kind of proof?" Jake's silence was answer enough. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind seeping through their shelter. "He wants our bodies." "Yes, and he'll want them found in a way that looks like an accident, or an attack by hostile Indians, something that can't be traced back to him. That means the men he sends won't just be killers, they'll be artists at covering their tracks." Emma adjusted her grip on Lucy, drawing strength from the solid warmth of her daughter's sleeping form. "So we can't just hide, we have to fight back. We have to eliminate the threat at its source," Jake agreed. "As long as Blackstone lives, you and your children will never be safe. He has too many resources, too many connections. Eventually, he'll find you." The implications of what Jake was saying settled over Emma like a shroud. This wasn't going to be a temporary exile, a brief period of hiding until things calmed down. This was war, and it would only end when one side or the other was completely destroyed. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "when you go after the colonel, you're not planning to come back, are you?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm and the steady breathing of the sleeping children. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had already made peace with his fate. "I've been dead for 8 years. Mrs. Hartwell, ever since the day I buried my family, I've just been going through the motions of living. If I can make Blackstone pay for what he's done, if I can give you and your children a chance at the life you deserve, then maybe my death will finally mean something." Emma felt tears sting her eyes as she understood the magnitude of what this man was offering. He wasn't just risking his life for strangers, he was planning to sacrifice himself to ensure their future, to find some measure of redemption in a world that had shown him precious little mercy. "There has to be another way," she whispered. "Maybe there is," Jake said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Martha Whitfield has connections throughout the territory, people who owe her favors and who aren't afraid to stand up to corrupt officials. If anyone can help us find a legal solution to this problem, it's her. And if there isn't a legal solution?" Jake's hand moved unconsciously to the grip of his revolver. "Then we'll settle this the way such things have always been settled in the territories, with gun smoke and prayer." Tommy stirred against his mother's side, mumbling sleepily. "Mama, are we still on our adventure?" Emma smoothed his damp hair away from his forehead, her heart breaking at the innocence in his young voice. Yes, sweetheart. We're still on our adventure. Is Mr. Morrison still going to teach me to be a cowboy? Emma looked at Jake, seeing the pain that flashed across his features at the boy's trusting question. We'll see, Tommy, we'll see. As the storm finally began to weaken and the first pale hints of dawn crept across the eastern sky, Jake stood and moved back to check on the horses. Emma watched him go, noting the way he carried himself like a man bearing an enormous weight, like someone who had taken on burdens that no single person should have to bear. Mr. Morrison, she called softly. He turned back to her, his face barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. Jake nodded once, then turned back to the horses. But Emma caught the brief softening of his expression, the momentary crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. This man who had come to kill them was instead dying a little bit more each day as he remembered what it felt like to care about someone other than himself. As they prepared to resume their journey to Martha Whitfield's trading post, Emma found herself praying not just for their safety, but for Jake Morrison's soul. She prayed that somehow, in the midst of all this darkness and violence, he might find a way to live again rather than simply choosing how to die. Her children needed a protector, but Jake Morrison needed something even more precious. He needed a reason to hope. The approaching dawn brought with it the promise of a new day, but also the certainty that their trials were far from over. Somewhere behind them, Colonel Blackstone's men were probably already investigating the empty homestead, tracking their trail through the mud and rain. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, but also the possibility of allies and sanctuary. As they mounted their horses and prepared to cover the final miles to safety, Emma Hartwell made a silent vow. Jake Morrison had saved her family when he could have destroyed them, had chosen protection over profit, had found something worth fighting for in their desperate situation. Now it was her turn to save him, to show him that redemption was possible, that the future could hold something more than revenge and death. The ghost of the Razorback Mountains had spent 8 years haunting the territory, bringing fear and violence wherever he rode. But Emma intended to help him discover that ghosts could be laid to rest, that the dead could find peace, and that even the most broken souls could learn to hope again. The sun rose slowly over the mountains, painting the storm-washed landscape in shades of gold and crimson. And in that new light, 4 riders made their way toward sanctuary, carrying with them the fragile seeds of something that might yet grow into redemption. Martha Whitfield's trading post sat nestled in Devil's Canyon like a fortress carved from the living rock itself. The weathered wooden buildings seemed to grow from the canyon walls, connected by covered walkways and defended by strategic positioning that made surprise attacks nearly impossible. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and the warm glow of lamplight in the windows promised sanctuary from the harsh realities of the territorial frontier. Emma felt overwhelming relief as they approached the main building, her exhausted children clinging to her despite their brave efforts to endure the grueling journey. Lucy had awakened during the final hour of riding, chattering sleepily about the pretty rocks and asking if they were riding through a fairy tale castle. Tommy had remained stoically silent, but Emma could feel the trembling in his small body that spoke of cold, fear, and exhaustion beyond his years. Martha Whitfield herself emerged from the main building before they'd even dismounted. A woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She wore men's clothing and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd survived decades on the frontier through wit, determination, and careful alliances. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as she helped Emma down from her horse. "Jake Morrison," Martha said, her voice carrying both warmth and wariness. "It's been 3 years since you darkened my doorway. I was starting to think you'd finally gotten yourself killed." "Still working on it," Jake replied grimly, lifting Lucy down with gentle care. "Martha, I need your help. These folks are in trouble, and it's the kind that won't go away on its own. Martha's sharp eyes assessed Emma and the children, taking in their obvious exhaustion and the fear that still lingered in their faces. Inside. All of you. Questions can wait until you're warm and fed. The interior of the trading post was a revelation. What appeared from outside to be a rustic frontier establishment proved to be surprisingly comfortable and well-appointed. Thick rugs covered polished wooden floors, and the furniture, while sturdy and practical, showed signs of craftsmanship and care. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, radiating warmth throughout the large main room. Emma sank into a chair near the fire, pulling both children close as Martha bustled about preparing hot food and dry clothes. The older woman moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for travelers in distress, asking no questions but providing everything needed for immediate comfort and safety. "Tommy, Lucy," Martha said kindly, "there's a room upstairs, with beds made up fresh and warm blankets. Your mama needs to talk with the grown-ups for a while, but you can rest and I'll bring you some hot soup." Lucy looked uncertainly at Emma, unwilling to be separated even temporarily. "Mama, are we safe now?" "Yes, sweetheart," Emma said, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. "Mrs. Whitfield is going to take very good care of us." Tommy, showing wisdom beyond his 8 years, took his sister's hand. "Come on, Lucy. Mama needs to figure out how to keep us safe from the bad men." After the children had been settled upstairs, Martha returned to find Jake staring into the fire while Emma sat wrapped in a thick blanket, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. The older woman poured 3 cups of strong coffee and settled into her own chair with the air of someone preparing for a serious conversation. "Now then," Martha said, her tone businesslike, "tell me what's brought Jake Morrison to my door with a widow and 2 young children, all of you looking like you've been riding hard from trouble." Jake told the story in spare, economical sentences, starting with Blackstone's contract and ending with their flight through the storm. He left nothing out: Emma's situation, his own change of heart, the likelihood that armed men were already pursuing them. Martha listened without interruption, her expression growing darker as the full scope of the situation became clear. "Garrett Blackstone," Martha said finally, spitting the name like a curse. "I should have known that snake would be at the bottom of this. He's been acquiring property throughout the territory through intimidation and worse, always managing to keep his hands clean while others do his dirty work." "You know him?" Emma asked. "I know of him," Martha replied grimly. "He's approached me twice about selling this place, each time with increasingly aggressive offers. The last time, about 6 months ago, he mentioned that accidents have a way of happening to stubborn people who don't recognize good business opportunities." Jake leaned forward, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "What kind of resources does he have?" "How many men?" "More than you can handle alone," Martha said bluntly. "He's got connections in the territorial government, contracts with the army, and enough money to hire every gun in Arizona if he puts his mind to it. If you're thinking of going after him directly, you'll be riding into a death trap." "Maybe," Jake said quietly. "But as long as he's alive, Emma and her children will never be safe. He's already killed her husband, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants." Martha studied Jake's face in the firelight, seeing something there that made her frown with concern. "You're planning something foolish, aren't you? Something that involves you dying heroically while taking as many of them with you as possible." "It's not heroic if it works," Jake replied. "And it's not smart if it doesn't," Martha shot back. "Jake Morrison, you've spent 8 years trying to get yourself killed, and you've gotten very good at staying alive despite your best efforts. But this isn't about you anymore. You've got responsibilities now." Jake's jaw tightened. "I never asked for responsibilities." "No, but you took them on the moment you decided to protect this family instead of destroying it. Those children upstairs are looking to you for protection, and their mother is trusting you with their lives. You don't get to throw that away on a suicide mission just because you're tired of living with your guilt. Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of the complex dynamics at play. Jake Morrison wasn't just planning to go after Colonel Blackstone, he was planning to die in the attempt, seeking some form of redemption through sacrifice. But Martha was right. Emma's children needed him alive, not martyred. There has to be another way, Emma said quietly. Some legal recourse, some way to expose what Blackstone's doing without getting everyone killed in the process. Martha nodded approvingly. Now you're thinking like someone who wants to live through this. As it happens, I might know someone who could help. Judge Harrison Wells is circuit riding through this area next week. He's one of the few territorial officials who can't be bought, and he's got the authority to issue warrants and call for federal intervention if necessary. That assumes we can stay alive long enough to reach him, Jake pointed out, and that we can prove Blackstone's crimes without getting ourselves killed gathering evidence. I might be able to help with both those problems, Martha said with a slight smile. You see, Garrett Blackstone made a serious mistake when he started threatening people under my protection. I've been collecting information about his activities for months, waiting for the right opportunity to use it. Martha rose and moved to a large safe built into the stone wall behind her desk. After working the combination, she withdrew a thick folder and returned to her chair. Property deeds, witness statements, correspondence between Blackstone and various territorial officials. I've got enough evidence here to hang him legally if we can get it to the right people. Emma felt a surge of hope for the first time since William's death. You mean we might not have to fight? We could actually bring him to justice through the courts. Possibly, Martha said, though her tone remained cautious. But there are still problems. First, we have to survive long enough to present this evidence. Second, we have to make sure Judge Wells lives long enough to act on it. Blackstone has a long reach and few scruples about eliminating threats to his operation. Jake had been studying the documents as Martha spoke, his expression growing increasingly grim. These dates and locations, if this is accurate, Blackstone's been operating his land grab scheme for over 2 years. How many families has he destroyed? At least 12 that I can document, Martha replied. Probably more that we'll never know about. Some sold out under pressure, others simply disappeared. William Hartwell isn't the first husband to die in a convenient accident after refusing Blackstone's offers. The magnitude of Blackstone's crimes settled over them like a weight. This wasn't just about Emma's family or even Jake's personal demons. They were dealing with a systematic campaign of terror and murder that had been destroying innocent lives throughout the territory. If we're going to do this legally, Jake said slowly, we need to get this evidence to Judge Wells without Blackstone knowing what we're up to. That means staying hidden until the judge arrives, then approaching him carefully and making sure he's protected long enough to act. Agreed, Martha said, but there's another problem. Blackstone's men will be searching for you, and they'll eventually think to check here. This place is known as a refuge for people running from trouble. We can't assume we'll remain hidden indefinitely. Emma had been thinking about their situation from every angle, and a desperate plan was beginning to form in her mind. What if we don't hide? What if we make Blackstone come to us, but on our terms and with witnesses? Both Jake and Martha looked at her with surprise. What do you mean? Martha asked. Judge Wells is coming here next week, right? What if we arrange for him to hold court right here, in your trading post? Make it a public proceeding, invite everyone in the area. If Blackstone wants to silence us, he'll have to do it in front of dozens of witnesses. Jake shook his head. Too dangerous. Blackstone won't hesitate to attack even with witnesses present. He'll just make sure none of them survive to testify. But what if some of those witnesses are people he can't afford to kill? What if we make sure the territorial governor's representative is present, or a federal marshal? People whose deaths would bring down too much scrutiny for even Blackstone to handle? Martha's eyes lit up with understanding. A trap. We use the legal proceeding as bait to draw Blackstone into a situation where he can't use violence without destroying himself. It could work, Jake admitted reluctantly, but it's incredibly risky. If we miscalculate, if he decides the risk is worth taking, we could all end up dead. Emma thought of William, lying broken in the high pasture while his horse wandered home riderless. She thought of Tommy and Lucy, who deserved to grow up free from fear and violence. Most of all, she thought of Jake Morrison, a man who'd been carrying the weight of death and guilt for 8 years, and who deserved a chance at redemption that didn't require dying to achieve it. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "you saved my children when you could have killed them. You've protected us when you could have collected your payment and disappeared. Now let me save you." Jake stared at her across the firelight, seeing determination and courage that reminded him painfully of Carolyn, Mrs. Hartwell. "Emma," she interrupted. "If we're going to risk our lives together, you should call me Emma." "Emma," Jake said softly, "you don't understand what you're asking. Blackstone isn't going to just give up because we have evidence against him. When cornered, men like him become desperate, and desperate men do terrible things. Then we make sure he's not cornered," Emma replied. "We give him a way out that doesn't involve killing us. A plea bargain, exile, something that lets him save face while paying for his crimes." Martha had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "You know, it might actually work. Blackstone's biggest weakness is his pride. He sees himself as a gentleman, a respectable businessman. Public exposure of his crimes would be almost as devastating to him as death." Jake remained skeptical. "And you think he'll just accept exile and disgrace rather than fight?" "I think he'll accept it if the alternative is a federal investigation that uncovers even worse crimes," Emma said. "Men like Blackstone always have secrets they're hiding. Once Judge Wells starts looking into his activities, who knows what else might come to light." The plan that emerged over the next several hours was complex and dangerous, but it offered something that neither violence nor hiding could provide: a real chance at justice. Martha would use her connections to ensure that the right people attended Judge Wells' court session. Emma would present her evidence while under the protection of federal authorities. And Jake would provide security, using his reputation and skills to ensure that Blackstone couldn't eliminate the threat through violence. But as they discussed the details, Jake found himself thinking not about the mechanics of their plan, but about what would happen afterward. For 8 years, his life had been driven by a simple equation: survive long enough to make someone pay for what had been taken from him. Now, for the first time, he was being asked to consider a future beyond revenge, a life that might include something more than death and solitude. "There's something else we need to discuss," Martha said as their planning session wound down. "If this works, if we manage to bring Blackstone to justice without getting ourselves killed, what happens then? Emma, you'll need protection while you rebuild your life. Jake, you'll need to decide whether you want to keep running or find a way to stop." Emma looked at Jake, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes. "You could stay," she said quietly. "Help me rebuild the ranch, help raise the children. Tommy still needs someone to teach him to be a cowboy." Jake felt something twist in his chest, a longing so powerful it was almost painful. The image of a quiet life, of children's laughter, and morning coffee and the simple rhythms of ranch work, it was everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. But it was also terrifying in its implications. "I'm not sure I remember how to be anything other than what I've become," he said honestly. "Then learn," Emma replied simply. "The way I'm learning to be something other than a victim. The way my children are learning to trust again, despite everything they've lost." Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and bright with possibility. As Jake looked out at the star-filled sky, he found himself thinking about Caroline and Rebecca, about the life they'd planned together. and the dreams that had died with them. For the first time in 8 years, he wondered if they would want him to keep carrying their deaths like a burden, or if they would want him to find a way to live again. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A rider arrived at dawn with word that Judge Wells had been delayed and wouldn't reach the area for another 2 weeks. Worse, there were reports of armed men asking questions in nearby settlements. Men who matched the descriptions of Blackstone's hired guns. "They're closing in," Jake said grimly as they digested this information. "We've got maybe a day, maybe 2 before they find this place." Martha nodded, her face grave. "Then we accelerate our timeline. I'll send riders out immediately to summon everyone we need. If we can't wait for the judge to come to us, we'll have to bring the fight to him." Emma felt fear and determination warring in her chest. Everything was happening faster than they'd planned, with less time to prepare and greater risks all around. But looking at her children, seeing Tommy's quiet courage and Lucy's innocent trust, she knew that they had no choice but to move forward. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Be ready to ride hard and fast," Martha replied. "And pray that we're as smart as we think we are." As they prepared for what might be their final gamble, Jake found himself standing beside Emma on the trading post's front porch, watching the sun rise over the canyon walls. The morning air was clean and cold, full of promise despite the dangers that lay ahead. "Emma," he said quietly, "if this goes wrong, if something happens to me, I need you to know something." She turned to look at him, seeing vulnerability in his weathered features that he rarely allowed to show. "What?" "You and your children, you've given me something I thought was lost forever. You've reminded me what it feels like to have something worth protecting, something worth living for. Whatever happens today, I want you to know that these past few days have been the first time in 8 years that I've felt truly alive." Emma reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his violent life. "Jake Morrison," she said softly, "you're not going to die today. You're going to live, and you're going to help me raise my children, and you're going to learn that the best revenge against the darkness is building something bright." Jake looked down at their joined hands, seeing hope and possibility in the simple contact. For the first time since Caroline's death, he allowed himself to believe that the future might hold something other than pain and retribution. "All right," he said finally. "Let's go build something bright." As they prepared to ride out toward an uncertain fate, Emma Hartwell and Jake Morrison carried with them more than just evidence and determination. They carried the fragile, precious seeds of redemption, planted in the soil of shared purpose and watered with the possibility of love. Whatever darkness awaited them, they would face it together, as a family forged not by blood but by choice, not by circumstance but by the conscious decision to protect what mattered most. The ghost of the Razorback Mountains had finally found something worth haunting for, a future where broken people could heal, where justice could triumph over greed, and where the dead could finally rest in peace knowing that the living had learned to hope again. The abandoned mining town of Silver Creek had once bustled with the dreams of prospectors and the thunder of heavy machinery. Now it stood as a monument to dashed hopes, its weathered buildings and rusted equipment scattered across a valley that had given up its treasures decades ago. But for Emma Hartwell and Jake Morrison, this ghost town would serve as the stage for their final confrontation with Colonel Garrett Blackstone and his network of corruption. Martha Whitfield had chosen the location carefully. Silver Creek sat at the confluence of 3 major trails, making it accessible to the witnesses they needed while providing multiple escape routes if their plan went sideways. More importantly, the town's layout offered defensive advantages: a main street with clear sight lines, buildings that could provide cover, and elevated positions for anyone skilled enough to use them effectively. Judge Harrison Wells had arrived 2 days earlier, his weathered face grave as he reviewed the evidence Martha had compiled over months of careful investigation. The territorial judge was a man who'd seen enough corruption to recognize it in all its forms, and Blackstone's activities represented the kind of systematic abuse of power that threatened the very foundation of law and order in the territories. "Mrs. Hartwell," Judge Wells said as they prepared for the confrontation that would determine all their fates, "I want you to understand the magnitude of what we're attempting here. Colonel Blackstone has powerful friends in territorial government and connections that reach all the way to Washington. If we fail to make our case stick, if he manages to discredit our evidence or eliminate key witnesses, he'll have the resources to make all of us disappear permanently." Emma nodded, her hands steady as she held the deed to her property and the letters that proved her husband's murder. "Your Honor, my husband died because he discovered silver on our land and refused to be intimidated into selling it for a fraction of its worth. My children have spent months living in fear, not understanding why their father didn't come home. If there's a chance to get justice for William and protection for Tommy and Lucy, I'll take whatever risks are necessary." Jake stood at the window of what had once been Silver Creek's hotel, his experienced eyes scanning the approaches to the town. 3 hours ago, one of Martha's scouts had reported a large group of riders moving toward the valley, led by a man matching Colonel Blackstone's description. The trap was working. The colonel was coming with enough men to overwhelm any normal resistance, confident that he could eliminate all the witnesses and destroy the evidence that threatened his empire. What Blackstone didn't know was that Jake Morrison wasn't the only skilled gunman waiting for him in Silver Creek. Martha's network included former soldiers, retired lawmen, and frontier veterans who had their own reasons for wanting to see justice done. They'd positioned themselves throughout the town, ready to ensure that any violence would be met with overwhelming force. "He's coming," Jake announced, turning from the window. 20 riders, maybe 25. They're taking their time probably, scouting for ambushes. Judge Wells adjusted his spectacles and straightened his robes, preparing to conduct court under circumstances that would have been unimaginable in more civilized territories. "Then we proceed as planned. Mrs. Hartwell, you'll present your evidence formally. For the record, Mr. Morrison, you'll provide security but only defensive action unless they fire first. Martha, your people know their positions?" Martha Whitfield checked the loads in her shotgun, her weathered hand steady despite her 60-plus years. "They know. Blackstone's walking into a crossfire he can't win, but we're hoping he'll be smart enough to surrender when he realizes his situation." Emma gathered her children close, both Tommy and Lucy unusually quiet as they sensed the tension in the adults around them. She'd explained as much as she could about what was happening, about the bad man who'd hurt their father and why they needed to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. Tommy had listened with the serious attention of a boy, forced to grow up too quickly, while Lucy had simply asked if the bad man would go away forever after today. "Whatever happens," Emma told them softly, "you stay close to Mrs. Martha and do exactly what she tells you. Can you do that for Mama?" Both children nodded solemnly, and Emma felt her heart break a little more at their acceptance of danger as a normal part of their lives. They deserved better than this, deserved to grow up without fear and violence shadowing their every step. Today's confrontation would determine whether they could finally have the childhood that had been stolen from them. The sound of approaching hooves echoed off the canyon walls, growing louder as Blackstone's force reached the outskirts of Silver Creek. Jake moved to his position behind the hotel's front desk, his rifle loaded and ready while remaining out of direct sight. Emma took her place beside Judge Wells at the table that had been set up in the center of the hotel's main room. The documents that would convict Blackstone spread out before her like weapons in their own right. Colonel Garrett Blackstone rode into Silver Creek like a man attending a social gathering, his uniform immaculate despite the long journey and his bearing, radiating the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. He was younger than Emma had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of handsome features that had probably opened doors throughout his military career. But there was something cold and calculating in his pale blue eyes that spoke of a man who viewed other people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings deserving of consideration. Behind him rode a collection of hired killers and corrupt soldiers, men whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and whose consciences had been seared by years of following illegal orders. They spread out through the street with military precision, covering exits and establishing fields of fire that would allow them to control the entire town if violence erupted. "Mrs. Emma Hartwell," Blackstone called out as he dismounted in front of the hotel, his voice carrying easily through the thin mountain air. "I believe we have business to discuss." Emma stepped out onto the hotel's front porch, Judge Wells beside her in his formal robes and Jake Morrison visible as a threatening shadow just inside the doorway. The sight of the territorial judge clearly surprised Blackstone, though he'd recovered his composure quickly enough to maintain his facade of legitimacy. "Colonel Blackstone," Judge Wells said formally, "you're just in time. We were about to begin formal proceedings regarding allegations of land fraud, intimidation, and murder in your jurisdictional area. I trust you'll want to participate in these proceedings, given that your name appears prominently in the evidence we've compiled." Blackstone's smile remained fixed, but Emma could see the calculation going on behind his eyes as he assessed this unexpected development. He'd come expecting to find a desperate widow and a single outlaw, easy targets that could be eliminated without complications. Instead, he was facing a territorial judge, multiple witnesses, and the kind of formal legal proceeding that would create records difficult to suppress or explain away. "Your Honor," Blackstone said, dismounting with deliberate care, "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. Mrs. Hartwell is squatting illegally on military property, and I'm here simply to enforce lawful eviction proceedings. Any allegations beyond that are the desperate fabrications of someone trying to avoid the consequences of her illegal actions." Emma felt anger surge through her at Blackstone's casual dismissal of her husband's murder and their family's suffering. But she forced herself to remain calm, to follow the plan they'd developed rather than letting emotion drive her into a mistake that could cost all their lives. "Colonel," she said clearly, 3 months ago, you offered to purchase my family's legally owned property for $300. When my husband refused your offer, he died in what you claimed was an accident. Last week, you hired Jake Morrison to kill me and my children to clear your claim to land that legally belongs to us. These aren't the actions of someone enforcing legitimate military policy." Blackstone's facade slipped slightly at Emma's direct accusation, and she saw something dangerous flash in his pale eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're clearly distraught by your recent losses. Perhaps grief has affected your ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. Then perhaps you can explain this," Judge Wells said, holding up a letter bearing Blackstone's official seal. "Your written instructions to eliminate the Hartwell family and claim their property as abandoned military land, signed in your own hand and witnessed by your aide-de-camp." The letter was one of several that Martha's network had obtained through careful infiltration of Blackstone's operations. Emma watched as the colonel's composure cracked further, his military bearing giving way to the desperate anger of a man whose carefully constructed lies were collapsing around him. "That document is a forgery," Blackstone said, but his voice lacked conviction. "A clumsy attempt to implicate me in criminal activities that I had no part in." "Perhaps," Judge Wells replied calmly, "but we have 17 similar documents, all bearing your seal and signature, all ordering illegal actions against property owners throughout this territory. We also have sworn statements from 6 of your former associates who are willing to testify about your activities in exchange for reduced sentences." Emma could see Blackstone's men shifting nervously as the legal trap closed around their commander. These were hired killers and corrupt soldiers, men who'd signed on for what they thought would be a simple intimidation operation. None of them had bargained for facing a territorial judge with enough evidence to hang them all for murder and conspiracy. Blackstone himself was clearly realizing that his usual tactics wouldn't work in this situation. He couldn't simply kill everyone present without creating exactly the kind of federal investigation that would expose his entire operation. But surrender meant disgrace, court-martial, and probably execution for the crimes he'd committed in pursuit of wealth and power. "Your Honor," Blackstone said, his voice taking on a desperately reasonable tone, "surely we can reach some accommodation. Here, I'm prepared to compensate Mrs. Hartwell generously for any inconvenience she may have experienced, and I'm sure any misunderstandings about my official duties can be clarified through proper military channels." Emma felt a moment of hope as she realized Blackstone was actually considering surrender rather than fighting. But that hope died as she saw Jake Morrison step out onto the porch, his presence shifting the entire dynamic of the confrontation in ways that no one had anticipated. "Hello, Colonel," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made even Blackstone's hired killers take a step backward. "I believe you have something that belongs to Mrs. Hartwell. $5,000 in gold, payment for a job I didn't complete." Blackstone stared at Jake with undisguised hatred, finally understanding the full scope of how thoroughly he'd been betrayed. The man he'd hired to eliminate his problems had instead become his greatest threat, turning the Hartwell family from victims into witnesses and transforming what should have been a simple murder into a complex legal challenge. "Morrison," Blackstone sighed, his voice thick with rage, "you were paid to do a job. The fact that you developed an inconvenient conscience doesn't change our agreement." "No," Jake replied, "but it changes what I'm willing to do to honor it. You wanted the Hartwell family eliminated. Instead, I'm eliminating the threat to the Hartwell family. Consider it a professional adjustment." The tension in the street was becoming unbearable as both sides waited to see who would make the first move toward violence. Emma could feel the weight of decision pressing down on all of them, the knowledge that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether justice or corruption would triumph in this corner of the Arizona territory. Then Lucy Hartwell, all of 6 years old and innocent of adult complications, made the choice for all of them. The little girl had been watching from the hotel window, her young mind struggling to understand why so many people looked angry and scared. When she saw her mother standing on the porch facing the man who'd hurt their family, Lucy's simple moral universe provided a solution that none of the adults had considered. "Mama," Lucy called out, her high voice carrying clearly across the 10th Street, "why don't you just tell the bad man to go away? Papa always said bad people should go away and leave good people alone." The innocent question hung in the air like a challenge, and Emma suddenly understood what her daughter was offering. Not violence, not legal maneuvering, but simple moral clarity that cut through all the complications and politics to the heart of what was really happening here. "You're right, sweetheart," Emma called back, her voice steady and clear. "Sometimes that's exactly what you have to do." She turned to face Blackstone directly, drawing strength from her children's faith in the fundamental justice of the world. "Colonel, you've caused enough pain and taken enough lives. It's time for you to go away and leave good people alone." Blackstone's face flushed with rage at being challenged so directly by a woman he considered beneath his notice. "Mrs. Hartwell, you seem to have forgotten your place. Perhaps it's time someone reminded you of the consequences of defying your betters." Emma felt fear spike through her as she recognized the dangerous shift in Blackstone's demeanor. The pretense of civilization was falling away, revealing the ruthless killer beneath the military uniform. She realized with crystal clarity that talking and legal documents wouldn't be enough to stop this man, that he was preparing to resolve the situation through the only method he truly understood. "Colonel Blackstone," she said, her voice carrying across the street so that everyone present could hear her clearly, "if you're determined to kill someone today, then kill me instead. Leave my children alone. Let them grow up in peace, and take whatever revenge you need on me." The words seemed to echo off the canyon walls, and Emma saw shock register on the faces of everyone present. She was offering herself as a sacrifice, gambling that even a man like Blackstone might have enough conscience left to spare innocent children if their mother paid the price for defying him. Jake Morrison felt something break inside his chest as he heard Emma's desperate bargain. Here was a woman willing to die to protect her children, offering her life with the same calm courage that Carolyn had shown in their final moments together. But unlike 8 years ago, this time Jake was present. This time he had the power to change the outcome, and this time he would not fail to protect what mattered most. "No," Jake said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through. "Silk, nobody dies today except the people who deserve it." Blackstone turned toward Jake with murder in his eyes, his hand moving toward the pistol at his side. "Morrison, you've forgotten who pays your bills. Stand down, or I'll add your name to the list of casualties." "I quit," Jake replied simply. "Consider this my letter of resignation." What followed happened with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. Blackstone's hand reached his gun just as Jake's rifle spoke, the shot echoing off the canyon walls like thunder from an angry god. The colonel staggered backward, his weapon falling unfired from nerveless fingers as he stared down at the spreading red stain across his immaculate uniform. Blackstone's men reacted with the confused desperation of hired killers suddenly deprived of leadership. Some reached for their weapons, others looked for escape routes, and a few simply stood frozen as they tried to process what had just happened. But Martha Whitfield's people were ready, and the crossfire that erupted from concealed positions throughout the town lasted less than 30 seconds. When the gun smoke cleared, Colonel Garrett Blackstone lay dying in the dust of Silver Creek's main street, his empire of corruption and violence crumbling around him like the abandoned buildings that surrounded them. Some of his men were dead, others wounded and calling for mercy, and the rest had thrown down their weapons in surrender. Emma ran to her children, gathering them close as Jake approached the fallen colonel. Blackstone was still conscious, blood frothing from his lips. As he struggled to speak, his pale eyes found Jake's face, and Emma could see him trying to form words that would never come. What did he want to say? Emma asked quietly. Jake looked down at the dying man, seeing not an enemy, but a cautionary tale about what happened. When grief and anger consumed everything good in a person's soul, probably that he was sorry, or that he was right, or that none of this was supposed to happen. Jake's voice was heavy with something that might have been pity. In the end, it doesn't matter. Dead is dead, and sorry doesn't bring back the people he killed. Judge Wells approached with the dignity that befitted his office, surveying the aftermath of violence with the weary acceptance of someone who'd seen too much of it over the years. "Mrs. Hartwell, you'll need to give a formal statement about everything that happened here. Mr. Morrison, you as well. This will need to be documented properly if we're going to clean up the rest of Blackstone's network." Emma nodded, still holding her children close. "Will it be over after that? Will we finally be safe?" "It'll be over," Judge Wells assured her. Blackstone was the head of this particular snake. With him dead and his records in our possession, the rest of his organization will scatter like leaves in the wind. Your property rights are secure, and your family's future is your own to determine. As the immediate crisis passed, Emma found herself looking around at the scene of violence and destruction, trying to process the reality that their ordeal was finally finished. William's murder had been avenged, their home was secure, and her children could grow up without fear of Colonel Blackstone's ambitions. But as she watched Jake Morrison carefully reload his rifle and scan the surrounding hills for additional threats that would never come, Emma realized that their story was far from over. Jake had saved them, had chosen protection over profit, and justice over revenge, but he was still a man carrying 8 years of guilt and pain. The question now was whether he would return to his life of violence and solitude, or whether he might find a different path forward. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said, tugging at Jake's coat, "are you going to leave now that the bad man is gone?" Jake knelt down to meet the boy's eyes, seeing hope and trust that reminded him painfully of Rebecca. "I don't know, son. I haven't had a home in a long time. I'm not sure I remember how to live in one place." "You could learn," Lucy piped up with the confidence of childhood. "Mama's teaching us lots of new things since Papa went to heaven. She could teach you too." Emma felt her heart clench at her daughter's innocent suggestion, but also at the possibility it represented. Jake Morrison was a dangerous man with blood on his hands and a reputation that would follow him wherever he went. But he was also someone who'd risked everything to protect her family, who'd shown her children kindness when he could have shown them death, who'd proven that even the most broken souls could find reasons to hope again. "Jake," she said quietly, using his first name with deliberate intimacy, "the ranch needs rebuilding, the children need teaching. I could use help with both those things if you're interested in staying." Jake stood slowly, his weathered face showing the internal struggle between his desire for redemption and his fear that he didn't deserve it. "Emma, I've done things, terrible things that can't be undone. The man you're asking to stay isn't. The same one who protected your family. He's got blood on his hands and enemies who might come looking for him." "Then we'll face them together," Emma replied simply, "the way families do." The word hung in the air between them like a bridge. Across 8 years of grief and isolation, family. Not the family Jake had lost, not the family Emma was trying to rebuild, but something new forged from shared purpose and mutual protection, and the kind of love that grew from choosing to stand together against whatever darkness the world might bring. Judge Wells cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I might suggest, this conversation might be better continued somewhere other than a battlefield. Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Morrison, you both have statements to give and paperwork to complete. After that, how you choose to live your lives is entirely up to you." As they prepared to leave Silver Creek behind, Emma took one last look at the ghost town that had witnessed the end of Colonel Blackstone's reign of terror. The abandoned buildings and rusted equipment seemed somehow less threatening now, as if the resolution of violence had lifted a shadow that had been hanging over the valley for decades. Tommy walked beside Jake, chattering about horses and cattle and all the things he wanted to learn about being the cowboy. Lucy held Emma's hand while carrying her precious doll, occasionally skipping with the uncontainable joy of a child who sensed that the adult world had finally become safe again. And Jake Morrison, the ghost of the Razorback Mountains, walked with them toward an uncertain but hopeful future. 6 months later, Emma Hartwell Morrison stood on the front porch of her rebuilt ranch house, watching her husband teach their son to rope a practice steer. The silver mine that William had discovered was producing steady income under careful management, providing security for their growing family and employment for neighbors who'd helped them through their darkest days. Lucy played in the garden with her new baby brother, James William Morrison, named for the father who died protecting his family and the man who'd lived to become their protector. Tommy had indeed become an excellent young cowboy, his natural courage tempered by Jake's patient instruction and his mother's firm moral guidance. Jake himself had aged in the best possible way, the hardness around his eyes softening as he remembered how to live for something other than revenge. He still wore his guns and kept his skills sharp, but they were tools of protection now rather than instruments of vengeance. The ghost of the Razorback Mountains had been laid to rest, replaced by a husband and father who understood that the greatest victory over darkness was building something bright. As the sun set over their peaceful valley, Emma reflected on the strange turns that life could take. She'd nearly lost everything to Colonel Blackstone's greed, had faced death in a dozen different forms, had watched her children grow up too fast in a world that seemed determined to steal their innocence. But in the end, they'd not just survived but thrived, finding in each other the strength to overcome anything the frontier could throw at them. Sometimes the most dangerous people, Emma had learned, were also the most capable of love. Sometimes, the most broken souls could be healed by the simple act of protecting something precious. And sometimes, when a woman was brave enough to say, "Kill me instead," she discovered that there were still people in the world willing to die to ensure that nobody had to die at all. The story of Emma and Jake Morrison became legend throughout the Arizona Territory, a tale of redemption and justice that reminded people that even in the darkest times, courage and love could triumph over greed and violence. Their ranch became a refuge for travelers and a symbol of what could be built when good people stood together against evil. And in the quiet moments between the daily routines of ranch life and family responsibilities, Jake Morrison sometimes thought he could hear Caroline and Rebecca's voices on the wind, not calling him to join them in death, but encouraging him to live fully in the light they'd never had the chance to see. He'd finally found his way home, not to the place he'd lost, but to the life he'd chosen to build with his own hands and heart. 5 years after the dust had settled in Silver Creek, the Morrison Ranch sprawled across the valley like a testament to what determination and love could build from nothing. Emma Morrison wiped her hands on her apron as she watched the latest group of travelers making their way up the winding path to her front door. Word had spread throughout the territories about the family that offered sanctuary to those running from their past, and hardly a week went by without someone seeking refuge beneath their roof. Jake emerged from the barn, his once black hair now streaked with silver, but his movements still carrying the fluid grace of a man who'd survived by being faster and smarter than his enemies. At 48, he'd found a peace that had eluded him for most of his adult life. Though Emma could still see him automatically scan the horizon each morning, old instincts refusing to die completely. He carried a hammer instead of a gun these days, spending his mornings building furniture and his afternoons teaching the children of neighbors how to handle horses safely. "More guests, I see," Jake said, settling his arm around Emma's waist with the comfortable intimacy of a couple who'd weathered storms together. "That makes 6 families this month seeking a fresh start." Emma leaned into his warmth, still marveling at how natural their partnership had become. "The Hendersons sent word from California that they've established their own ranch and are prospering. Sometimes I think we're running less of a cattle operation and more of a hope factory." Their daughter Lucy, now 9 years old, came racing around the corner of the house with their youngest child, 3-year-old Samuel, toddling behind her on unsteady legs. Lucy had grown into a spirited girl with her mother's determination and her stepfather's keen observation skills, though she used those talents to organize elaborate games rather than plan strategic defenses. Samuel was the spitting image of Jake, complete with serious gray eyes that seemed to take in far more than a toddler should notice. "Mama, Papa Jake," Lucy called out breathlessly. "Tommy says the new people have a baby, and Mrs. Patterson from town brought news about that. Mean sheriff everyone was talking about." Emma felt Jake tense slightly beside her at the mention of trouble, his protective instincts still sharp despite years of peaceful living. "What kind of news, sweetheart?" Mrs. Patterson, a widow who ran the general store in the nearest settlement, approached with the purposeful stride of someone bearing important information. She was one of the few townspeople who knew the full story of Jake's past and Emma's ordeal with Colonel Blackstone, and her discretion had helped maintain the family's hard-won anonymity. "Emma Jake," Mrs. Patterson said, slightly out of breath. "From the ride, I thought you should hear this directly. That new sheriff over in Tombstone, the one who's been making noise about cleaning up all the old outlaws, he's been asking questions about Jake Morrison. Someone told him the ghost of the Razorback Mountains was living quiet somewhere in this area." Jake's expression didn't change, but Emma felt his muscles coil like a spring preparing to release. Despite the years of peace, despite the legal pardons Judge Wells had helped arrange for Jake's cooperation in cleaning up Blackstone's network, there would always be lawmen looking to make their reputation by bringing down a famous outlaw. What kind of questions? Jake asked, his voice carrying none of the alarm Emma knew he must be feeling. The usual kind. Descriptions, known associates, possible hideouts. But here's the thing that struck me as odd. He wasn't asking like a lawman trying to arrest someone. He was asking like someone trying to find a person for other reasons entirely. Mrs. Patterson paused, her weathered face creasing with concern. Jake, I think this sheriff might be someone from your past. Someone with a personal interest in finding you. Emma watched as Jake processed this information, seeing him mentally cataloging faces and names from his outlaw years, trying to identify who might have both the motivation and authority to track him down. The ghost of the Razorback Mountains had made many enemies during his years of robbing trains and banks, and not all of them had been on the right side of the law. Tommy approached from the corral, now 12 years old and showing signs of the man he would become. The boy had Jake's height and Emma's intelligence, but more importantly, he possessed a moral compass that had been carefully cultivated by parents who understood the difference between strength and violence. He'd overheard enough of the conversation to understand that potential danger was approaching their sanctuary. Are we in trouble? Tommy asked directly, his young voice steady despite the concern in his eyes. Jake knelt down to meet his stepson at eye level, a habit he'd developed to ensure that children never felt talked down to or excluded from important family matters. Might be, son. But if we are, we'll handle it the way we handle everything else. Together, as a family. Lucy, ever practical despite her young age, tugged at her mother's skirt. Mama, if bad people come looking for Papa Jake, can't we just tell them he's not the same person anymore? Can't we show them all the good things he's done? Emma's heart ached at her daughter's innocent faith in the power of redemption to overcome past sins. Sometimes, sweetheart, people only see what they want to see. They might not care about the good things if they're focused on the bad things that happened before you were born. The approaching travelers had reached the front yard, a young couple with 2 small children and an infant, their wagon loaded with everything they owned, and their faces bearing the hollow exhaustion of people who'd been running for too long. Emma recognized the look she'd worn it herself years ago when Jake had first found her family hiding in their overturned wagon. Mrs. Morrison, the man called out, his voice hoarse with fatigue. We heard tell you might have room for folks needing a place to rest and figure out their next move. We can work for our keep, and we won't be any trouble. Emma stepped forward with the gracious hospitality that had become second nature to her over the years of welcoming strangers. Of course you're welcome. Let's get you settled in the guest cabin and see about getting some food into those children. There's always room at the Morrison Ranch for people trying to build something better. As they helped the new arrivals unload their belongings and get situated, Emma noticed Jake's continued vigilance. He positioned himself where he could watch the valley approaches while appearing to simply assist with the luggage, and she caught him checking the loads in the rifles they kept mounted inside the barn. Old habits were reasserting themselves, as the possibility of danger reminded him that peace was always temporary in their part of the world. That evening, after their guests had been fed and settled for the night, the Morrison family gathered in their kitchen for the kind of serious discussion that had become necessary whenever outside threats encroached on their carefully constructed sanctuary. Jake sat at the head of their handmade table, Emma beside him with Samuel on her lap, while Tommy and Lucy took their usual places where they could see both parents' faces. Here's what we know, Jake began, his tone serious but not frightening. Someone with sheriff's authority is looking for me, and they're being careful about how they're asking questions. That suggests either someone with a personal grudge who's managed to get themselves elected to office, or someone who's been hired to find me for reasons that might not be entirely legal. Emma shifted Samuel to her other knee, her practical mind already working through possibilities and preparations. Could it be someone from Blackstone's organization who escaped the initial roundup? Possible, Jake acknowledged. We know not everyone in his network was caught, and some of those Men would have every reason to want revenge. But it's been 5 years, and most of them would have moved on to other territories by now. Tommy raised his hand slightly, a habit left over from the informal schooling Emma provided. Papa Jake, if someone dangerous comes here, what do we do? Do we fight them, or do we run away? Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Emma could see him struggling with the fundamental tension that had defined their life together. He'd built this sanctuary as a place where violence had no power, where broken people could heal and families could grow without fear. But he was also a man who understood that sometimes violence was the only language that certain people understood. "Son," Jake said finally, "we try talking first. We try showing them that the man they're looking for doesn't exist anymore. That Jake Morrison the outlaw died years ago and was replaced by Jake Morrison the husband and father. But if talking doesn't work, if they threaten our family or our guests, then we do whatever is necessary to protect the people we love." Lucy, with the startling insight that children sometimes possess, looked up at her stepfather with solemn eyes. "Papa Jake, are you scared of being the bad man again?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow, striking at the heart of his deepest fears about himself. For 5 years, he'd worked to prove that redemption was possible, that a man could change his fundamental nature through love and commitment to something greater than himself. But the weapon skills were still there, the tactical thinking, the ability to kill efficiently when necessary. Sometimes he wondered if he was truly reformed or simply a wolf who'd learned to live peacefully among sheep. "Yes, little one," Jake admitted, his honesty as much for himself as for his daughter. "I'm scared that if I have to fight again, I might remember too well how good I used to be at it." Emma reached across the table to take his hand, her touch grounding him in the present rather than the violent past. "Jake Morrison, you are not the same man who robbed trains and shot people for money. You're the man who chose to save a family instead of destroying them. You're the man who built a sanctuary for people seeking second chances. If you have to fight to protect us, it won't make you a bad man, it will make you a father doing what fathers do." The next morning brought news that settled the question of what they were facing. Tommy came racing back from his morning chores with word that riders were approaching, at least 6 of them moving with the deliberate pace of men on official business. Jake armed himself with his old revolvers for the first time in years, the familiar weight both comforting and disturbing. Emma gathered the children and their guests in the reinforced root cellar that Jake had built precisely for situations like this. The man who rode into their yard wore a sheriff's badge and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But when he removed his hat and looked directly at Jake, Emma saw something unexpected in his weathered features, not hatred or vengeance, but profound sadness and what might have been hope. "Jake Morrison," the sheriff said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of authority and uncertainty, "I'm Sheriff Daniel Crawford. I've been looking for you for a very long time." Jake stood relaxed but ready, his hands near his weapons, but not threatening. "Sheriff Crawford, I take it this isn't a social call." "No, it's not," Crawford replied. "But it's not what you might expect either. Jake, I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because 8 years ago, you saved my life, and I never got the chance to thank you properly." Emma saw Jake's expression change as recognition dawned. Sheriff Crawford had been a young cavalry lieutenant named Daniel Crawford when Jake had still been Captain Morrison, serving together during the worst years of the Apache conflicts. Emma remembered Jake mentioning a young officer he'd pulled from a burning supply wagon, but the name had been lost among so many stories of men who died or disappeared in the chaos of frontier warfare. "Danny Crawford," Jake said softly, his defensive posture relaxing slightly. "I heard you'd made it through the war. Last I knew, you were planning to study law back east." "I did," Crawford said, dismounting but keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "Got my degree and came back to the territories because I believe in law and order, not the kind that comes from the barrel of a gun, but the kind that comes from decent people working together to build something better." Jake felt Emma's presence beside him before he saw her, his wife emerging from the house with their youngest son in her arms, and determination written across her face. She'd armed herself with William's old shotgun, and Jake could see that she was prepared to fight too. Defend their sanctuary if words and recognition weren't sufficient. "Sheriff Crawford," Emma said politely but firmly, "my husband has been legally pardoned for his past actions in exchange for his cooperation in dismantling Colonel Blackstone's criminal organization. Judge Wells has all the paperwork on file with the territorial government." Crawford nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm aware of your husband's legal status. I'm not here in any official capacity regarding his past activities. I'm here because I need his help with something that's threatening innocent people throughout the territory." Jake felt the familiar tug of old responsibilities, the call to action that had once driven him to serve his country and later to seek violent justice for his murdered family. But he also felt the weight of new responsibilities, the knowledge that he was no longer a man whose only obligation was to his own pain and anger. "What kind of help?" Jake asked carefully. Sheriff Crawford gestured toward his men, who'd remained mounted but relaxed throughout the exchange. "There's a new gang operating throughout the territory, led by a man calling himself the Preacher. They're not ordinary outlaws. They target families, entire communities, and they leave no survivors. They've hit 6 settlements in the past 3 months, and they're getting bolder and more vicious with each attack." Emma felt ice settle in her stomach as she understood what Crawford was implying. "You think they might come here?" "I think they're going to come here," Crawford said grimly. "The Preacher has been asking questions about the Morrison Ranch, about the families that come here seeking sanctuary. He sees this place as a symbol of everything he's fighting against: peaceful settlement, law and order, the idea that people can change and build better lives." Jake processed this information with the tactical mind that had kept him alive through years of violence and uncertainty. Again, targeting families and communities represented the kind of threat that couldn't be negotiated with or reasoned away. If the Preacher was indeed planning to attack the ranch, then everything Jake had built, everyone he was protecting, would be in mortal danger. "Sheriff," Jake said quietly, "what exactly are you asking me to do?" Crawford met his eyes directly, and Jake saw in them the same desperate hope that Emma had carried when she'd first begged him to spare her children. "I'm asking Jake Morrison, former cavalry captain and the most effective fighter I've ever known, to help me stop these animals before they destroy everything decent people have worked to build in this territory." Emma watched her husband's face as he weighed the impossible choice before him: return to violence to protect the peaceful life he'd built, or maintain his commitment to redemption and hope that others could handle the threat to their family and guests. She knew that either choice would cost him something essential, would require him to sacrifice part of who he'd become or who he was trying to be. "Jake," she said softly, her voice meant for his ears alone, "whatever you decide, we'll face the consequences together. But remember that being a good man sometimes means doing hard things to protect good people." Jake looked around at the ranch he'd built with his own hands, at the children who called him father, at the guests who'd found safety beneath his roof. He thought of Caroline and Rebecca and wondered what they would want him to do. He thought of William Hartwell, who died trying to protect his family's future, and whether honoring that sacrifice meant taking up arms once more. Finally, Jake Morrison made his choice, knowing that whatever came next would define not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who'd found hope and healing at the Morrison Ranch. The ghost of the Razorback Mountains was about to ride again, but this time, he would ride not for revenge or gold, but for the simple right of good people to live in peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.